All right, let's dive into Roman Africa. Now, this wasn't just some random province. Oh no. This place was so vital, they called it the breadbasket of the entire empire. But here's the crazy part. A series of crises and the really radical solutions meant to fix them they ended up tearing the whole thing apart from the inside out. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How does a massive, powerful empire actually break itself? Is it always about the invaders at the gates, the barbarian hordes? Or is it something more, like a sickness that starts from within? When it comes to Roman Africa, the answer is, it's complicated. So, to really get how Roman Africa fell, we've got to rewind the clock. We're going back to the 3rd century. And let me tell you, the entire Roman Empire was teetering on the absolute brink of collapse. It looked like it was all over. But then a really powerful emperor stepped up with let's call it a radical plan to save it all. And ironically, that's where the trouble really begins. Okay, so let's set the stage here. We're in what historians call the 3rd century crisis. The empire, which had been expanding for centuries, just stopped, and its whole economic and military models started to fall apart. To give you an idea of the chaos, in just 50 years, a staggering 32 different emperors tried and failed to hold the thing together. It was a total mess. And then, along comes a guy named Diocletian. He looks at all this chaos and has this major realization. He figures out the fundamental problem. The empire is just too big. It's too vast, too complex for one guy to rule effectively. So his solution? It was absolutely revolutionary. He decided to divide and conquer, not new lands, but the empire itself. Now, this division wasn't just some random line on a map. No way. Diocletian was smart about it. He basically drew a line right along a cultural fault line that already existed. You had the West, which was very much a Latin-speaking, Latin culture kind of place, and then you had the East, which was firmly Greek in its culture and language. This split, which started as just an administrative thing, would end up creating two very, very different destinies. So, how do you manage this new, divided empire? Well, he came up with something called the tetrarchy. Fancy word, but it just means rule of 4. The idea was pretty straightforward. You'd have 2 senior emperors, the Augusti, one for each half of the empire, and each of them would be assisted by a junior emperor, a Caesar. The whole point was to create stability and, crucially, a clear line of succession to avoid all those civil wars. And this whole idea of divide and rule trickled down to every single level. Take the huge province of Africa, for example. It got carved up into all these smaller, more manageable districts. The goal, of course, was tighter control from the top. But it also had a major side effect. It completely fractured regional identities and power structures that had been in place for generations. A classic case of unintended consequences. But Diocletian wasn't done yet. He knew that reorganizing borders wasn't enough. He needed to unify the empire's beliefs, its very soul. And this next big idea, it would lead to a direct and epic conflict, the emperor versus God. So how did he try to do this? By reviving the old imperial cult, but on a massive, massive scale. Suddenly, the emperors weren't just rulers anymore. They were declared to be actual gods on earth, and they demanded worship. This wasn't just some political PR stunt, it was a religious command. And you can probably see where this is going. It put the empire on a direct collision course with this rapidly growing faith that worshipped only one God, Christianity. The result was something we now call the Great Persecution. For one absolutely brutal year, the Roman state threw everything it had at trying to stamp out Christianity for good. But the whole thing backfired, spectacularly. Instead of breaking the Christians, the persecution just made their faith stronger. It created heroes and martyrs, and ironically, it drew even more people to their cause. And believe it or not, the fallout from this persecution was especially bad in Africa. This crisis planted the seeds for a brand new division, a deep split that would eventually lead to the creation of Africa's very own separate Christian church. Okay, so picture this. During the persecution, some Christians, we're talking even priests and bishops, they cracked under the pressure. To save their own skins, they handed over their holy scriptures to the Romans. After it was all over, they got stuck with this one single damning label, traitores. It literally means the ones who handed over, the traitors. This, as you can imagine, led to a huge, soul-searching question. What do we do with these traitors now that the persecution is over? On one hand, you had the official Catholic Church, which basically argued for forgiveness and mercy. But on the other hand, you had this huge, really hardcore faction in Africa that said, no way. They believed that a priest who had betrayed the faith was forever tainted. And worse, any sacrament he performed, any baptism, any communion, was totally invalid. So in the year 312, this simmering disagreement just exploded. A bishop named Donatus Magnus, along with a whopping 70 other bishops, just broke away entirely. They created a rival church, a church for the pure, and they declared that their church was the one and only true church in all of Africa. Now, this massive religious split, it didn't stay a quiet theological debate for long. Oh no, it spilled out of the churches and onto the streets. It merged with all these deep-seated social and economic problems, the poor versus the rich, and it ended up igniting a whole century of violent rebellion. A rebellion against landowners, against the wealthy elite, and ultimately against Rome itself. And this is where we meet a group called the Circumcellions. I want you to picture them. They started out as these poor, seasonal farm workers just trying to get by. But their anger against the rich landowners who were exploiting them found a perfect outlet in the Donatist cause. They basically became the militant wing of the movement. We're talking about guys fighting trained Roman soldiers with farm tools, all fueled by this incredible, fervent desire to die as martyrs for their faith. So you have this explosive mix of religious fury and social rage, and it ended up fueling two massive rebellions against Rome. What's crazy is they were both led by brothers from a powerful local tribe. First came Firmus, and then later his brother Gildo, and they rallied this coalition of Donatists, fed-up Roman discerners, and local tribes, all under one banner: get Rome out. But the second revolt, the one led by Gildo, was especially dangerous for Rome. See, Gildo wasn't just some rebel leader out in the provinces. He was a Roman general himself, in command of Africa. So when he rebelled, he did something devastating. He blockaded the grain supply. He literally threatened to starve the capital city of Rome. He was holding the very heart of the empire hostage. Okay, now the official Roman story of how Gildo was defeated is, well, it's frankly unbelievable. The records claim he was beaten by his own brother, a guy named Maghreb, who supposedly had an army of just 5,000 men against Gildo's 70,000. I mean, come on. The victory was so ridiculous, and the fact that Maghreb himself was mysteriously killed right after, yeah, most historians today think there was some serious political backstabbing going on behind the scenes. So, even after these massive revolts were eventually crushed, the damage was done. The deep wounds in African society just never healed. The endless conflict between the Catholics and the Donatists had basically poisoned the entire province. It was left fragile, divided, and just utterly exhausted. You had brilliant guys like St. Augustine trying their best to heal the divide. They held debates, they wrote these amazing theological arguments, they called church councils, but it was just too little, too late. This split wasn't really about theology anymore. It was about identity, it was about class warfare, and it was about 100 years of bad blood and bloodshed. And then we get to the year that changed absolutely everything. You see, that century-long, bitter struggle between Catholic and Donatist, it was never actually resolved by them. Instead, in 429 AD, an outside force just erased the whole conflict. The Vandals, a Germanic tribe, swept across the Strait of Gibraltar, and they found a province that was so bitterly divided and so weak from infighting. Honestly, they didn't really have to conquer Roman Africa. They just had to kick in a rotten door. Which brings us right back to our big question at the start, doesn't it? Were the Vandals this mighty force that conquered Roman Africa, or did they just show up to pick up the pieces of something that had already shattered? All the evidence seems to point to one incredible irony, that the very solutions meant to save the empire, dividing it up, forcing a single belief, ended up creating the very cracks that broke it apart from within.